All right, so for my community resource audit, I looked at undergraduate students' information seeking behavior, and I specifically looked at undergraduates in a research context. So just to quickly define the community, I looked at undergraduates at a higher education institution, and I did not limit the community by any kind of year, academic year, or any specific demographic group, as behavior is kind of similar across all these categories of students. But as I mentioned, I looked at undergraduates in a research context, and this means any students who are completing research tasks as either part of a class or an undergraduate research project. And these students shared characteristics with undergraduate information-seeking behavior in general, but the task-oriented nature of their behavior kind of influenced their information needs and had implications for the creation of my resource guide. So just to quickly talk about some behavior associated with this population. There are cognitive, emotional, and different perceptual factors that influence these students' behavior and research competency. And the first is that they can lack flexibility when performing research. Really, they just stick to Google. And that's something that was true across undergraduates, whether they're conducting research or not, or researchers found that was likely. A lot of the literature discussed undergraduate researchers' cognitive skills and their beliefs about the nature of knowledge and knowing and reflective thinking, and found that students with more sophisticated beliefs were able to reflect better and employed more complex search strategies. And then, of course, there were kind of some emotional factors involved. This is where library anxiety came into play, and students' control of their emotions influenced their resource selection. With anxiety, with stress, with kind of more negative emotions, they default to Google, essentially. And a quote I liked was from Kwan, competence breeds competence and vice versa. And just students' perception of their research abilities also affected their research. They vastly overestimate the research abilities. They rate themselves highly, but they just stick to Google. So, it's worked for them in the past. Why change, kind of thing. Even when they receive assistance, they tend to stick with what they know. And a lot of this is tied to Google and is tied to information literacy and knowledge of resources outside of Google. So basically paper after paper that I reviewed for the project suggested information literacy instruction as the best way to address the issues and help students excel as they perform research. So basically, when thinking about my guide, my goal was to create something that would be useful in these instruction sessions and something that would be applicable to kind of a broad range of topics, since I wasn't looking at student research in any specific subject area. Quickly, before we look at the resource guide and talk a little more about that, I just wanted to go over some search strategies. So basically, I looked at two areas. The first was selecting the right resources for students, which meant steering them towards library resources. The guide isn't for completely inexperienced undergraduates. It was for undergraduates who have some familiarity with the library. But since it would be used for information literacy instruction, I looked at how the pros handle it, I guess you could say. I went through dozens of libguides on everything from information literacy instruction to resource suggestions for certain fields to search strategy guides. I looked at instructional videos online hosted on different academic library websites, looked at different department web pages, different pathfinders, different databases, reference works, reviewed different vendors. And on the right there, I have addressing student habits, and I felt it was important to kind of address, the reliance on Wikipedia and Google, how to identify quality resources, resource quality, and how to address students' limited search skills. So those are the three other areas outside of specific resources that I wanted to touch on. So let's take a look at the guide. All right, so as I mentioned before, my resource guide was created with the idea that it would be used in an information literacy instruction session. So as far as the dissemination of the guide goes, it could be used in these sessions. So the literature also encouraged faculty to incorporate information literacy instruction into a program if they're advising undergraduates perform research for that course. And the guide could also be used printed out and used at a reference desk or circulation desk, kind of as an example, as an instruction tool in the library. With that in mind, I created 11 by 17 booklet. Just quickly go through it. That has the resources, search tips, and the front. It's beyond Google. I have resources for undergraduate research, and I wanted to address 3 questions off the bat. What's wrong with Google? what about Wikipedia, and how do you know if a source is credible? So I kind of run through each of those, talk about how Google can be inaccurate, results can be manipulated, and how it looks at a limited section of the internet and often can't crawl library databases. Wikipedia can be edited by anybody, and I point them to Britannica or other scholarly resources. And how do you know if a source is credible? Basically, one of the papers I read said that students should be taught to look for terms like scholarly or peer-reviewed, and I touched on that there. Back of the guide has some search tips, and this can be used by the instructor as they're demonstrating research in a specific topic area. Have Boolean operators with a few examples there. Touch on subject headings with some examples, and that's something the instructor could go a little more detail about as they're showing students how to utilize the guide and library resources. And just some quick tips on limiters like date, language, things like that. So headed to the inside of the guide. There you can see kind of the whole spread, but I'll fold it in half and kind of do each side in a second. Basically, I wanted databases to be right down the middle, since databases can be kind of the meat of the research, looking for journal articles and things like that. So I picked EBSCO and ProQuest. Each vendor, provides dozens of databases on different subjects. So if they just kind of go to the library, select EBSCO, they'll be able to see a list of quality databases. And I highlighted 4 each. For instance, Medline, PsycInfo, Academic Search Complete, Periodicals Archive Online, ProQuest SciTech Collection. So they kind of cover different topics, different subject areas. So no matter what kind of class you're using this in, you can point to one of these databases to suggest it, or just suggest the vendor and another database that they provide. And I also included here at the bottom other excellent databases, which were databases that I found were standouts in their field. I've used them. They're recommended on a lot of department websites and things like that. And that's JSTOR, LexisNexis Academic, Web of Science, and PubMed. So moving over to this side, I have my reference resources here. Again, I chose reference providers, so students could go to the provider page and search for resources. I included just a quick introduction that talks about what different reference resources are. So if a student is looking for a map or an atlas or something like that, they know that this is where they can go to find them. I profiled Oxford, Gale, Sage, and Credo, and I also have Britannica there at the bottom for reference resources. And I also, included just a note here. My catalog was for WorldCat. So since this would be in information literacy instruction, the instructors should be using the institution's library website. But I wanted to include WorldCat just so students could know somewhere else they could go to find the research if necessary. Or a resource if it's not at their institution, and WorldCat can help with that. Finally, this other resources side, these were kind of just some resources I thought were important and could be helpful to students, but didn't fit under the database category or reference category clearly. And I included LibGuides with some instructions for students. They can search for topics and pathfinders and things like that. And I kind of referenced LibGuides a couple other times with some tips throughout. The Directory of Open Access Journals for free access to online open access papers. Also, this was kind of debated, but I included a note here on Google Books and Google Scholar. I could kind of foresee that question being asked, so I took that opportunity to include them and say, hey, if you find something through Google Scholar, it can be useful, but if you want the full text, go to the academic library, same for books. And then I finally down here at the bottom, I just included a note about Purdue OWL, the online writing lab for students who are, creating the reference sections and things like that. So the guide is just a booklet, and it is designed for use in instruction sessions. Thank you.